got to come out with it. And the answer from the administration was, we realize that, meaning that obviously they called him while he was home, while he was on this ultra-conservative kick, to give him ammunition so he would bring it out and make an issue of it. Carter's objectives are fairly clear. At the point that non-crisis broke, he had never been lower in the polls. His political future was, and still is, very much in doubt. And he needed some issue that he could, some crisis, or preferably awful-sounding non-crisis, so that he could thump his chest and show how macho he is in handling this non-crisis, and so he did.
But didn't this backfire in some ways against Carter because he wasn't able to effectively do anything about it? That is, he couldn't get the Russians to remove the troops, that it made him look weak again.
Oh, the networks made... this is what surprised me by looking at the coverage of it. The networks constantly made Carter look like a fool.
The president sought counsel from the congressional delegation. To the distinguished Jacob Javits, Mr. Carter said, "What would you do?" Replied, "You mean you called us here at 8:30 in the morning to ask us what we would do? What are you going to do?" Senators and congressmen were told the U.S. asked the Soviet Union if the troops were combat troops. Answer from Moscow, no. The U.S. asked if they would take the troops out anyway. Answer, no. Another answer to the same question is expected within a few days. Inquiry, how many days? President, 2 or 3 days. Vance, not that fast. Javits, can we have another meeting? Yes, within a week. Vance, not that fast. That is what you call your basic linkage between Cuba and SALT. Even though, sources said, the meeting was told the United States still does not know why the Soviet troops are there. And we do not know exactly how serious it all is.
Another congressional leader present accused the president of trying to have it both ways, of being hard on one hand and soft on the other. According to this source, the meeting was not very enlightening or satisfying. Senate Democratic Majority Leader Robert Byrd didn't even bother to attend the meeting with the president. Byrd claimed that he had received a briefing from Secretary Vance last night. The result of today's meeting, the president did win some more time. However, he did not generate much confidence in his leadership.
The president hopes this policy will convince hardliners, particularly those in the Senate who are holding the SALT Treaty hostage, that he has effectively neutralized the Russian troops, while at the same time proving anew that he does not panic in a crisis and risk general war. But already the president's plan has hit one tiny snag. Mr. Carter wanted to go on television Sunday night, and word of that leaked so widely in Washington that one afternoon newspaper here headlined the Carter talk on Cuba on Sunday. Then the White House discovered that Sunday was the high holy Jewish holiday Yom Kippur, and so in some confusion, it rescheduled the speech for Monday night. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, the White House.
They gave a lot of TV network coverage to Connolly and Baker and these right-wing Republicans attacking Carter for being soft. So I think Carter really lost politically on this one. Also, after the speech that Carter made, where he outlined his plan, immediately the headlines on the 10 o'clock news were Russian troops to stay in Cuba, as if Carter had not really done anything and had therefore failed to be a strong leader.
Well, isn't there a certain justice in that, though, because this whole thing started with an operation Brzezinski and the CIA juned up to embarrass Cuba and the Soviets. And but they worked for President Carter. The CIA is part of the White House, and Carter permitted it, apparently encouraged it to be brought out and made public and made into an international issue. And in that sense, it's backfiring on him as a certain amount of justice. He had Secretary Vance make the statements and make an issue out of it, throw the gauntlet down, say the status quo is unacceptable. And the amateurishness of this administration was shown right then and there, in that the status quo was unchangeable by the United States, except this very weak solution he came up in the end of that, well, we can't do anything about the Soviets in Cuba, so we'll increase our own military activity around. You always wonder how much something like this was planned ahead of time, since it had so much of an effect of encouraging the hawks and leading to greater military activity and spending, how much of it was determined ahead of time? Let's make an issue of the Soviet troops there so we can get into this defense spending.
Particularly since they'd known about it for 17 years.
Since they'd known about it for 17 years.
Well, I noticed frequently that they would toss around the CIA as, well, we have good intelligence. I got a briefing by Stanfield Turner, blah, blah. They would be bringing it in as if that would automatically give the stamp of expertise on it.
I was just in a briefing with Stanfield Turner, the head of the CIA, a few moments ago, and he believes that those troops are not there just to train Cubans. However, we do not know the mission of those troops.
Early this morning, National Security Council members, including CIA Director Turner and Secretary of State Vance, arrived to continue talks with the president, which went on here until late last night.
About Senator Baker's suggestion that the president now release intelligence photographs of the Soviet troops in Cuba, ABC News diplomatic correspondent Barry Dunsmore reports the State Department will oppose doing that while negotiations are still underway. But if the talks break down, release of the evidence might be a good idea.
It's amazing how they would dare to do that when you have this history of incredible, endless intelligence failures by the CIA, and crisis after crisis after crisis, the CIA coming up with faulty or false information. And for them to cite Stanfield Turner in a situation like this. Remember the last U.S.-Cuban confrontation where President Carter was calling President Castro a liar, and vice versa, was a year and a half ago at the time the Katangese invaded the Shaba. And President Carter said that we had intelligence that it was a Cuban operation. And Castro said it absolutely was not a Cuban operation, that it was Katangese and Cuba had nothing to do with it. And President Carter did much as they had there. He had CIA, the CIA had information proving it. Eventually, it was resolved by some senators going down to Havana and meeting with Castro at his invitation, and he convinced them that there was reasonable doubt. And they went back and demanded and were shown the CIA's intelligence, and the 17 senators walked out of that meeting and said it didn't prove the presence of Cuba behind that invasion at all. In other words, in yet another situation, President Carter was not telling the truth. He was misinformed and he was distorting the information, lying, if you will, and Fidel Castro was telling the truth.
What amazes me, once again, is the absolute distortion of Gromyko speech and the Russians' position. The Russians admitted they had troops there and that they'd been there for a long time. Gromyko said, this is a foolish put-up job and let's forget about it and get on with the business of salt. And yet then the senators would come and say, Gromyko's lying. Yes, he's an absolute liar.
He called it like it was.
Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko today dismissed the American charge with a short, blunt demand, forget it. In his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Gromyko said it was all part of a campaign to spread lies about the policies of Cuba and the Soviet Union.
But the truth is that this propaganda is totally without foundation in reality. And our advice on this score is simple. It is high time that you honestly admit that this whole matter is artificial and proclaim it to be closed.
Although Mr. Gromyko did not even mention the presence of Soviet troops in Cuba, it was clear this is what he was talking about. Just 2 weeks ago, the Soviet Union admitted it does have troops in Cuba, but only to train the Cubans in Soviet military hardware, that their duties and numbers have not changed in 17 years, and that any charges that organized Soviet combat units have arrived in Cuba are totally groundless. And Mr. Gromyko insisted that there's no reason for concern.
The Soviet Union and other countries of the socialist community have never threatened anybody, nor are they threatening anybody now.
This is Lou Cioffi, ABC News at the United Nations.
This is Ann Compton at the Capitol, where senators who have seen American intelligence photos say Gromyko is lying.
I'm astonished. There is simply no basis for doubting that the Soviet Union, that the Russians have a fully equipped, fully manned combat brigade in Cuba. would hope that the President now would consider releasing the very, very reliable